You can imagine being a homeschool mom, quietly homeschooling over your kitchen table and hear vehicles coming up your road. And, do you get a chance to say goodbye? How long will it be before you see your kids again?
What kind of foster home are they going into? That would be,
Exactly.
that's terrifying. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Schoolhouse Rocked Podcast. I'm so glad you're back with me. This week, we are back with my dear friend, Audra Talley. And last week, if you did not listen, you need to go listen because we did a little trip through history back to the 80s as Audra was homeschooled back then and just kind of got a feel for what it was like. Her parents are my homeschool heroes. And although I've never met them, I see the fruits of their labor every day as I get to hang out with my friend Audra. And I have learned so much about the way that they educated their child, and it's really inspired me. But before we get back to our conversation, I need to thank our first sponsor, and it's Apologia. We absolutely love Apologia. I use it with my kids. It's been our absolute favorite. So if you're looking for a trusted homeschool resource to support your child's education with a strong biblical worldview, Apologia is the answer. For decades, Apologia has been a go-to source for Christian homeschool curriculum designed to educate, inspire, and build a lifelong love of learning. And that's the goal. But that's not it. Apologia knows that homeschooling isn't a one-size-fits-all. That's why they offer a growing catalog of digital resources to fit your family's unique needs. Dive into online self-paced courses, join live classes led by incredible instructors, or stream engaging video lessons anytime, anywhere. They even offer audiobooks perfect for learning on the go. With Apologia, you're not just choosing a curriculum, you're choosing a partner in your family's education journey. Explore the full lineup of Apologia homeschool resources today at apologia.com and discover how they can help your family thrive. Apologia, equipping families, inspiring learners, and teaching truth. Okay, Audra, welcome back. I'm so glad we're back together again this week. I loved our conversation just about what your homeschool kind of looked like growing up. Really, more than that, just how your parents taught. And if you didn't hear that episode, you need to go back and you need to find the part where Audra talked about her dad and how he talked about how important it is to have a marriage between real life and our academics, real life and education, because that's what education is it is real life. And if there is a disconnect, then there's really no purpose. It's kind of pointless, right?
Yeah, we have to be able to take what we know and what we've learned in that kind of academic setting and use it in real life. Otherwise, it doesn't have value outside of that ability to contextualize and use those sources and information.
Right. Okay, so Audra, a little bit more about you that we didn't divulge last week, but you are, I would consider, an expert on not only all things homeschool, because you were homeschooled and you do homeschool, but you have your head wrapped around, and I want you to share a little bit about homeschooling history, just when it comes to laws and the legality of it, because you lived some of those early pioneer years. You had experiences with your parents when here in our state, Audra and I live in Idaho, it was actually illegal to homeschool in Idaho. And so I want you to dive in to that story a little bit about your parents' challenges with that, what that was like, what the landscape of homeschooling was like. Did you come from the era where you were like shutting blinds and that sort of thing? And then we're going to kind of fast forward to what it's like today, because you're kind of known as the poster child for homeschool freedom, for, keep maintaining and keeping our homeschool freedom, privately funded, independent homeschooling. And without a doubt, I believe that's probably due to the threats that you saw as a child, and that you know that our freedom is never really secure unless we stand for it. So take us back to the 80s in your state, and what was the landscape of homeschooling then?
Well, in Idaho, homeschooling was something of a contentious thing. In the 80s, you could homeschool, but the statute was such that the supervision of homeschoolers fell to the superintendent of schools for that particular school district. Now, where I grew up, I don't think our superintendent cared. I mean, it was pretty laid back, pretty quiet. We were also very rural. And so you didn't really have anybody to hide from, because in a town of 450 people, everybody's too busy doing their own thing to kind of be snooping into their neighbor's business. So it was kind of a common thing for us, but it wasn't common everywhere in Idaho. And that level of just kind of acceptance of homeschooling was not common everywhere in Idaho. And one of the most pivotal events in Idaho homeschool history happened in the early 80s when a district superintendent for a school district down here in southern Idaho decided he did not like how a homeschool family in his school district was homeschooling their kids. And because the statute kind of gave him supervisory authority over them, he wielded that kind of with an iron rod and really wanted to treat their homeschool setting as if it were a public school. So he was very much, he wanted, them to operate during normal school hours. He wanted them to have a fire escape plan. He wanted to know what curriculum they were using. He wanted them to, what their educational background was. And at some point, the parents kept trying to provide him the information, provide him everything he kept asking for. And eventually they just couldn't meet all the requirements. And it came to a head when he put his foot down and said, you're sending your kids to public school or you're not schooling. And the parents said, we can't because we feel like God has called us to homeschool our kids. And he sent the sheriff out to their homes and arrested the parents and put their children in foster care.
Wow.
And it just, if you ever have an opportunity just to hear that story, I don't know if you can imagine being a homeschool mom, quietly homeschooling over your kitchen table and hear vehicles coming up your road. And, do you get a chance to say goodbye? How long will it be before you see your kids again?
What kind of foster home are they going into? That would be,
exactly.
That's terrifying.
And they had nursing infants in the family at that time. And the whole family, all three families were separated from their kids. And the parents served jail sentences for this situation. And unfortunately, and fortunately, to me, this is a testimony of how God uses something that was meant for evil and turns it to good.
Right.
But in the midst of this, it really brought the homeschool question, so to speak, that had kind of been being done behind closed window doors and closed blinds and, in rural mountain communities, whether or not this was a good thing. And there was actually at that time a move in the Idaho State Legislature to outlaw homeschooling outright. And my parents, even in the middle of nowhere, this got media attention and they started hearing about it. And they felt so strongly that homeschooling was not an optional undertaking. It was something they were convicted that they had been called to do, and that it was important for them to engage in the defense of that ability. And so they actually traveled the 6 hours to southern Idaho from our home to talk with legislators, to testify in committee hearings in support of homeschooling in an effort to make it more, I guess, a more protected undertaking than it had been before. And it took about a decade before Idaho got to a place where parents were at liberty to educate their children as they saw fit, as they were led by the Lord, without direct intervention from the state or direct supervision from school superintendents. So it was a long fight.
Yeah. It was for the long haul, right? And I'm sure many grew weary. But what I find interesting is this whole thing started with just a very small partnership with the public schools, right? It was just a little, hey, no big deal. We have no problem with homeschooling. Homeschooling's fine. You just need to have your local superintendent check off that they're okay with that, right? No big deal, not a ton of regulations. And then what happened?
Well, as soon as you had a superintendent who was bent on taking advantage of that, he did. And it really created a situation where there was no winning for these parents. There was no way they could meet the criteria that particular school district was requiring of them.
Right. So the regulations were small, like you said. Hey, we just need to know, one little thing, and then that you're homeschooling. That's all. Just tell us you're homeschooling, and then it was okay. We need a fire escape plan, which is
right, which is crazy. They were setting up a public school inside the four walls of this family's home.
That's what they were doing.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah. And
exactly.
so
And the regulations just came on stronger and stronger. And the other
stronger.
thing that really struck me it is that your parents, just due to the nature of your location, again, you were small, rural, mountain, not very many people, they didn't
Mhm.
feel it. I mean, people left you alone, you homeschooled, your parents didn't actually necessarily feel it, but they had, again, the word is conviction. The reason they homeschooled you from the beginning was conviction. And they, again, had a conviction that even though this isn't directly affecting us today, right now, right? I mean, we
Right.
can still, our superintendent isn't making life hard. They still said, you know what, this is still our battle for the future. These are our children's freedoms. This is
Yes.
our people. This is our community. This is what God has called us to do. And so your parents took up the fight, even though they were not directly affected by it in the moment. And they could have so easily just said, hey, you know what? I'm living my life. It's not
Right.
going to affect me today. It probably won't even affect me tomorrow. I'm going to just do my thing. But they didn't. Their conviction moved them to action.
Precisely. And we as Christians and as Americans in particular as well need to remember that the things we do or don't do now, both
Right.
positive and negative, will impact the future. And I feel like a lot of times we don't realize how dramatic of an impact that will be. Because again, for our family, it wasn't a huge deal, but they felt called to engage in that particular battle. And then you look at it now, it took them and another family and other families in the state to go, okay, this may not impact me right now
Right.
in this moment, but this is a battle worth fighting for
Yes.
and over. And them coming together, if it weren't for all those families taking the individual initiative to stand up and not just homeschool, but also stand in defense of the right to homeschool,
Right.
our state wouldn't be where it is now. And it's today, Idaho is the freest state in the nation when it comes to
Right.
homeschooling. And
Right.
that is an amazing heritage. It's an amazing outcome for people who stood on conviction and
Yes.
then put feet to that conviction.
Right.
Um,
Right. And I think that's
it's a
what it
miracle.
is it is a miracle, but it's a miracle where God used his people who were willing, like you said, to stand on conviction and to be forward thinking for generations to come, right? And
Exactly. Yep.
to not just do what God has called them to do, but to stand in defense for others to do it as well. And we need to take a quick break, but we're going to come back and we're going to take those lessons of that generation because that's what we're called to do. We're called to look to the men and the women that have walked before us, right? And that's why, like your dad said, we have to yoke real life with education and we teach our kids history. But why do we learn history, right? So we can learn from it and gain from it and grow from it and put it into practice in the future. So we're gonna break to a sponsor really quick, and then we're gonna be back and finish this conversation and see what we can learn from that generation. We'll be right back.
Have you tried CTC Math yet with your child? Here's a testimonial from another happy homeschool mom. Amber said, "I'm absolutely thrilled with CTC Math. It's a rare find that I've used with my children for more than 5 years now. I have 6 children using CTC Math, and each child has found it easy to navigate and very applicable. Thank you so much for all that you are doing in providing quality math lessons for my children." If you're looking for a great online math program, visit ctcmath.com. That's ctcmath.com.
We are back. And so Audra was just telling us about kind of the threats to freedom in her generation when she was a kid. And my guess is, correct me if I'm wrong, but your parents didn't leave you at home with a math book and trudge off to the city 6 hours away to fight the fight. I'm assuming you were in tow, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Every time. There were days actually, honestly, I got tired of being towed around, but looking back on it, I was so glad that that happened.
I'm
I remember
sure.
them. I remember them going down to the legislature at this time, and all of us kids were in tow, and it was a long drive. Like I said, it was 6 hours if the roads were good, and sitting in the upper area around the Senate floor or the House floor and listening to testimony and being able to go to private conversations with legislators and talk about the issue. And I mean, homeschooling was one of a handful of issues my parents were involved with politically. So we got lots of exposure to a lot of politicians over the years
Oh, I'm
and those
sure.
conversations. So yeah, it was very much kind of part of the fabric of of my life growing up was being engaged on an ongoing basis with what was going on in the community at large, not just in my, in our four walls.
Well, and there was your civics, there was your government, there was every
Mm-hmm.
class you could imagine, and you got schooled in that far more than you would have staying stuck at home with a textbook, I am
For
sure.
sure. For sure.
Right, and your story
Yeah.
reminds me a little bit, if you guys have not heard our episode with Zan Tyler, if you just go to schoolhouserocked.com and you go to podcasts and you search in there Zan Tyler, you're going to find an episode with her. And she was in probably about the same era, but down south, dragging her kids to their state house, doing the exact same thing. And it's an incredible story. I love hearing about that generation. And I would love if the story ended there and you guys, your parents fought for our freedom. We won our freedom. And now the rest of us can just kick back and, live off, what do they say? Live off the fat of the land. Is that how
Right. Yeah.
But Audra, I'm getting a sense, and we've talked about this on this podcast before. We are faced with dangers to homeschool freedom currently right now, and they're not exactly the same, but honestly, they are the same. They're just wrapped in a little bit of a different paper. And so do you feel that, there was a time period where everybody could kick back and relax, but are we in the middle of the same battle again? And can you kind of talk to that a little bit?
Sure. The adage that we're never more than one generation away from losing our freedom is
Right.
so true, because we get comfortable in the space that we're in and the benefits that we're living through, and we kind of we don't engage as fully as we need to with what's going on around us. And yes, we are in a generation now where the same risks that we saw 30 years ago, 40 years are back. They're just wrapped up in a different package. Back then it was, we don't want you homeschooling, or if you're going to homeschool, we're going to make it look like a public school at home situation. Right. Now the threats are coming out. Well, fine, you can homeschool, but we'd like to give you some money to homeschool.
Yeah.
We would like to pay you to do what you've been convicted to do in the first place.
So they just want to help us.
They just want to help us. And unfortunately, as much as I love the United States, as much as I love our system of government, as much as I feel God has blessed this country, the reality is that governments as an entity are not always vested in what is in the best interest of our families and our kids. And so they have sometimes ulterior motives. Sometimes you have people who have good motives in our legislature, but they aren't thinking big picture of the long-term ramifications of what they're offering. And currently what they're offering is money for homeschooling.
Right.
And we can go into a deep dive and why that's problematic, but we really don't have enough time. But
no, and we have, and if you guys want to go back and search on our podcast, the school choice, if you just look up Schoolhouse Rock School Choice, you're going to get all the reasons we're opposed to this there. But we just want to share a little bit about that, just because we are called to learn from history. And Audra is the perfect example of the parents who fought the battle. But like she said, we're not more than one generation away. And so it's so interesting because here she sits now as an adult, and she is sitting in the same legislative sessions, right? Fighting the same fight, essentially.
Fighting the same fight over again. And, I feel like this generation that has been so deeply blessed by the liberty that we have don't realize that these new offerings for funding is going to pull back those liberties a little at a time. And families who are focused more on the, how do I do this? I can't do this. I'm not equipped to do this. I can't afford to do this. Rather than relying on God or treating government like their provider and God like their insurance policy. And really, it really comes to we've got our priorities or our focus is shifted the wrong direction. Totally. God is our provider, not the government. And ultimately, we have to, everything in life, including schooling, including how our government works, including how we engage with our government and what partnerships we engage in educating our children, have to come back to the first and foremost partner we engage with is God.
Right.
And everything else has to be second to that.
Right. And if we engage in a partnership outside of that, say other families or the church, then we need to make sure that we are equally yoked with those people as we partner
True.
with them. And the reality is, like you said, we are not equally yoked with the government when it comes to raising and teaching and training our kids, right? They do not have the same direction that they're going. We are teaching and training our kids to live in awe and in wonder of who God is, to know God,
Yes.
to be known by God, and ultimately to have a foundation on his word as the ultimate authority. That is not the government's goal with our children. So as we yoke with other families or the churches, we want to make sure that we are equally yoked, and we are not equally
Right.
yoked with the government as we homeschool our kids. So Audra, because I couldn't have your parents on, and I'm not saying that you are a second, you are not, but I want to ask you as a kid that was raised up as a homeschooler, that is now homeschooling your kids, that you are such a success story, and mostly not because I'm, flattering you, but because you love God with your whole heart and because you are doing his will. And to me, that is the ultimate success of what we're doing in raising our kids in homeschool. If you could share, and I didn't prep you for this, so I'm kind of throwing this at you. If you could share a couple of the top takeaways from your parents and how they homeschooled and raised you, what would those be?
I would say that the top takeaway that I saw in my parents' life was their utter and complete reliance on God.
Mm.
It's easy to say we need to rely on God. It's easy to tell our kids that, but to watch that day in and day out, year after year, day upon day, watching my parents live that calling out had a profound effect. And I got to be witness up close and personal because we were never apart. We were always
Right.
together. There was never a time where I saw the bad days, I saw the good days, but ultimately they were relying on God. And I think that was evidence that as homeschooling parents, the key to being a successful homeschool parent is never to look to anyone else for the things that God has promised to provide us,
Yes.
because his faithfulness is unmatched. And I got to see his faithfulness with my parents. I'm watching his faithfulness in my day-to-day life. I'm doing my best by God's grace to live his calling on my life for my kids as well. And that when they walk away from this homeschool education, what I want for them to have is that utter and complete reliance on the goodness of God. And everything else will fall into place if they have
Right.
that.
Right. Seek first the kingdom of God. And you're an example of that, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
if that is what your parents put all their time and effort into, if they truly homeschooled you out of conviction and complete dependence upon God, which they did, all of the academics, all of the education, it came for you. I mean, I look at you, are very well educated. I mean, it worked. It worked. It worked because when we
Yes.
do things God's way, it will work. When we have things in the right
Yes.
order. That was my biggest takeaway from your parents. The other is I just love that your dad, that education and life has to be married. There has to be a union between real life and education. There is no separation, right?
Yeah,
Those two things
absolutely.
go hand in hand and it makes it real. And the last big takeaway I had that I want to leave our audience encouraged is engage your kids in the process. We have to,
Yes.
this generation, every listener here, whether you feel the effects of regulation in your state, whether you are seeing the school choice money come into your state and the regulations that will guaranteed will follow, you have to be engaged. And I encourage you to be engaged before it's too late. I encourage you to be engaged whether you feel the effects or not, because quite frankly, none of us are probably feeling the effects that are going to be coming in this exact moment, but they will come, and we need to be engaged, and we need to engage our children. We need to be dragging our kids down to the state house. We need to have them in the room when we're making the calls to our legislators. We need to be
Yep.
telling them why we're doing what we're doing. We're doing it because God has called us to do something. We're answering God's call, and because we care about them and their future. And so don't think that you are in a season that you can't engage because you have 6 kids at home, you're up to your eyeballs in laundry and school and dinner. That's okay. That's where God is going to show up. And so drag those babies down there. You'll give your kids
write letters.
Write letters.
Write letters.
Absolutely. Let your kids write letters to the legislators and let them know that this is what we want. And Audra, I guess I want to ask you that last question. What would you say if people say, what do homeschoolers want? What did your parents want? What do we want when it comes to legislation, when it comes to bills, when it comes to help from the government? What is it that we really want?
Well, the simple answer is we want nothing from the government because we get everything we need from God. Everything we need comes from the Lord, and we don't need anything from the government. We just need the space to follow his calling in our lives.
Yes, I love it. We're actually the only people that show up down at the State House wanting nothing, right? Everybody else shows up down there and they want this and they want that. And we show up with our babies and our kids and we just say, we just want our freedom. We want nothing. Just leave us be. Let us answer the call. And your parents did it well, and they raised a generation in you that is doing it well. And so thank you so much for answering that call, for continuing the trajectory, and for just being a voice and encouragement for all homeschoolers across the United States. Audra has worked incredibly hard. If you ever go to homeschoolidaho.org, she is so much of what's behind homeschoolidaho.org/school choice. She is the writer behind that. She is the writer. You will find her on Substack. You will find her everywhere, just preaching this message. And we are just thankful for her. We're thankful for her parents. And we are just praying that we can all raise a generation that would do this. So thank you, Audra, for coming on. It was a total blessing. Where else can people find you if they want more information or just encouragement from you?
Audra at homeschoolidaho.org. That's pretty much where you can reach me.
Yeah, email her your questions. She's very smart. She's very, very smart and very encouraging. And one of the most objective people that I've ever met. So anyway, thank you for being with us this week. We're so glad you're here. We will be back next week with a new guest and a new host. And so it's really fun. We are loving this new way that we're doing things because you get to hear from more voices. It used to be Yvette and I and one guest, and now that's the beautiful thing about homeschool is everybody does it different, and there's so much wisdom, and we're all so unique. And so the way that the Schoolhouse Rocked is doing things is that you're going to get a different host each week, a different guest each week, a different voice of wisdom. But what you will always get that we can promise you is everything will be rooted in God's word. Everything will be founded on God's word, and you will always get biblical encouragement. So please come back next week and go check out schoolhouserock.com. Watch the movie. Please watch the movie. Watch it with your kids. It's free. I know we tell you that nothing is free. Nothing is free, but the movie really is free. I don't know. It is free. Someone paid for it. But it's free. Go watch it. It's amazing. Watch it as a family movie. Now that all the Christmas movies you're done. You need something new for January. That's the one. You can find me at Aby Rinella, His Calling My Passion, calltothetop.com, anywhere on social media. And we love you guys, and we're thankful that you joined us today.
What can poison dart frogs, monarch butterflies, and jellyfish teach us about God's truth and love? It's time to return nature study to its rightful place as theology, the study of God. That's exactly what we do on Nat Theo, Nature Lessons Rooted in the Bible, a podcast for kids which recently ranked number 4 for education for children in the USA. I'm Erin Lynham, host of Nat Theo and a certified master naturalist, Bible teacher, author, and educator. Join thousands of families listening to Nat Theo for their science and Bible lessons. Listen today on your favorite podcast platform or at erinlynham.com. That's ERYNLYNUM.com. Reconnect the dots between creation and creator as your children learn real, fun science from a biblical worldview.
We always go to what needs to be improved, don't we, in our minds? But it is so important to bathe your mind actually in all of the wonderful things that God has done. If I was just to focus on the challenging things as I'm doing this exercise, then what would happen is the outcomes wouldn't be as good. But if we bathe our mind on all that God has done first and all the wonderful things and actually write those out, we are now ready to have a right mindset, to hold our thoughts captive in the obedience of the Lord, to actually be able to think about in a constructive way, not a negative way, the areas we need to improve.